Let's take you live to Westminster now on BBC Two for the latest developments and political news with Andrew Neil and the Daily Politics.
Afternoon, folks. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Manchester police say they will no longer share intelligence about Monday's bomb attack with their US counterparts after more information, including photographs, is leaked to the US media. Have the leaks harmed the investigation and transatlantic relations? A minute's silence is observed across the UK as the victims of Monday night's attack are remembered. Political campaigning has now resumed, but how different will it be in tone and content? UKIP launched its manifesto this morning. Will they be able to take advantage of increased concerns about security and extremism? And net migration falls by 84,000 to 248,000. It's progress for the government. But do the Conservatives have any chance of meeting their manifesto target of reducing it to the tens of thousands? So all that coming up in the next hour. With us for the duration today, the former Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott. Welcome back to the programme. First this morning, police investigating the Manchester Arena bomb attack have stopped sharing information with the US after leaks to the media. UK officials were reportedly outraged when crime scene photos appearing to show debris from the attack appeared in the New York Times. The pictures show bloodstained fragments from the bomb, including a battery, shrapnel and a possible detonator, or it could be something else. They also show the backpack used by suicide bomber Salman Abedi to conceal his device. The Prime Minister is expected to raise the intelligence leak directly with President Trump at a NATO meeting in Brussels today. And in the last hour, this is what Theresa May had to say about the ongoing investigation.
I have just chaired a meeting of COBRA where I was updated on the extraordinary response of the police and emergency services to Monday's horrific attack. The police have confirmed that 8 suspects remain in custody and that progress is being made in the case. But the threat level, as assessed by the Independent Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, will remain at critical, and the public should remain vigilant. I was also briefed on Operation Tempora. Around 1,000 members of the armed forces are assisting the police, providing important reassurance ahead of a bank holiday weekend of busy events. Shortly, I will be travelling to the NATO summit, where I will be working with international colleagues on defeating terrorism. I will make clear to President Trump that intelligence that is shared between our law enforcement agencies must remain secure. Tomorrow I will be attending the G7 summit in Italy, where I will lead a discussion on counter-terrorism and on how we will work together to prevent the plotting of terrorist attacks online and to stop the spread of hateful extremist ideology on social media. I'm very grateful for the expressions of support and condolences that the UK has received from international colleagues in recent days. G7 and NATO will enable us to work more closely together as we work to defeat the evil of terrorism.
That was the Prime Minister earlier this morning. Let's speak now to our security correspondent, Frank Gardner. Frank, let's start with the leak and then come on to the wider investigation. Am I right in thinking this about the leak? This isn't just a case of a New York Times correspondent speaking to his security sources. The security sources, probably the FBI, I would guess, didn't just guide his hand. They passed all these pictures and data to him. Am I right to find that remarkable?
You are absolutely right, Andrew, and it is deeply shocking. It comes just hours after Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, had voiced her irritation at the fact that the name of the bomber, which the police wanted kept secret until they were ready for it to be released, that was revealed to NBC News. That was leaked out of US intelligence. She said this should never happen again, and guess what? It did happen again, and in a far worse way. This leak is damaging for many reasons. First of all, it's deeply disrespectful to the families of the victims. These are pictures of the device that killed their loved ones. They shouldn't have to see this, certainly not at seeing it splashed across a newspaper and the media like this. Secondly, there is the operational aspect of it. It's telling the terrorists, the very people, this network, who are being hunted right now across the country, but particularly in Manchester, it's telling them how much is known. It's giving them clues about, what has survived from that blast. By the way, that's an initiator, that thing that was held in his hand, slightly different from a detonator. And then also, it's damaging to the whole US-UK intelligence sharing arrangement, which is part of the Five Eyes arrangement, where the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada share information. Under that arrangement, the country that provides the information owns it, in inverted commas, meaning that nobody else can actually share it with anybody else unless they go back to the source country and say, would you mind if we share this? And if somebody said, do you mind if we splash this right across the New York Times? Britain's very unlikely to have said yes. So my understanding is that the source of this it's come via liaison officers, because the way it works is that the US and UK have people embedded in each other's countries, and the information is shared through there. But somebody in one of the 16 US intelligence agencies, possibly Homeland Security, has shared it with the media, and that's what Theresa May is going to be taking issue with Donald Trump about shortly.
Now, I understand, Frank, that the British are obviously, rightly, outraged by what has happened, but they're trying to limit the damage. I'm right in thinking that they're not passing on more information about this particular investigation, but the wider intelligence sharing between the US and the UK, that is continuing.
That is continuing, exactly. This ban only applies to information or intelligence, sensitive intelligence, that has been gathered by Greater Manchester Police on the ground at the scene. It does not apply to other intelligence-led information that MI5 or MI6 or GCHQ may gather. That part of the relationship remains intact. But, of course, it's going to raise questions in Whitehall about, can we trust the Americans? This has come just days after Donald Trump was accused of telling the Russians more than he should have done about a source inside ISIS in Syria, which would have told them where an agent, possibly from Jordan or Israel, was hidden. So it's very undermining this of the whole intelligence sharing relationship. Ultimately, though, US intelligence is many, many times bigger and better funded than any other countries in the world, even Russia and China. So, that's why people in the intelligence community in Whitehall and in Cheltenham will be scrambling to kind of ring fence their relationship and say, look, this only applies to the GMP police-sourced information, not to the wider relationship.
Frank, let me come on now to the investigation itself. A lot of activity in the Greater Manchester area as they try to, I assume, try and track down a cell or where the bomb-making capability and who was behind it was taking place, but also an increasing Libyan connection as well.
Yes, there was a slight false alarm a few minutes ago when EOD, explosive ordnance disposal, bomb disposal, basically rushed to what could have been an explosive device. It turned out just to be a suspect package that was not a bomb. The race is on. Let's not beat around the bush here. The race is on to try to find what they suspect are more devices. Who knows how many there are? Maybe one, maybe none, maybe several. But that's why we're still at critical, and why Theresa May in the last few minutes has said Britain will remain at terror threat critical, which means that another attack could be imminent at any minute. Doesn't mean to say it definitely will be, but it could be. They can't rule out that possibility because They are absolutely convinced that this bomber was not working alone. He probably didn't even build this device himself. Chemicals were acquired, probably in this country, and mixed together by somebody who knew what they were doing, using bomb-making skills that had been honed in the Middle East or possibly North Africa, of the same level of sophistication as the ones that were used at the Bataclan attack in Paris in November 2015. So that's why you're seeing these well-armed, well-protected teams going in with dogs, with laser beams, with C8 DeMarco rifles, assault rifles, and going in expecting to find, to certain addresses, expecting to find quite possibly a suicidal bomber in there. And eventually, hopefully, they will find the device and the person who's done this.
Frank Gardner at Broadcasting House, thank you for joining us on the Daily Politics today. John Prescott, it's quite remarkable, the leaks in America. I mean, you know, journalists, we all like leaks, we like scoops, but we also never want to do anything that could get in the way of the security forces tracking these people down.
No, and a number of times I've written about, which I'm concerned about, the relationship between GHQ and the American intelligence, because leaking has been part and parcel of even the American system. What's so alarming about this is that somebody made a decision just to print such horrific details about such a terrible incident, and indeed open the argument about what is the value of the sharing of intelligence between the main intelligence agencies, which in this case is the Americans, and ourselves. And I see that Mrs. May, who's over there now to meet Mr. Trump
in Brussels,
and one of her policies is to improve the sharing of intelligence. Well, what's the question now is whether you can trust Americans to give them shared intelligence in this way. It's dramatic. It's a game changer. We've got to rethink the whole policy.
I mean, it's baffling to me. What would America, whoever did this, whether it was Homeland Security or the FBI, as Frank says, there are 16 different intelligence agencies in America. What's in it for them? What's the benefit of them giving this to the New York Times?
Well, Andrew, you know more than most. The relationship between police, intelligence and press is very close. And very often it's about, I'll give you a bit of information if you give us that. And we've seen it in our system as well. And I really can't see a rational explanation why they should do it, because it's so horrific, given the circumstances, and revealing and making it more difficult to track down the terrorists. So, to be honest, there's got to be a complete review of it. I mean, she's over now talking to Mr. Trump or President Trump about sharing intelligence. By God, she'll need to do that. I think she'll have to go further, because in the manifesto we're talking about later, she says we've got a clear terrorist strategy. It's only one line in the paper. We can't even get a debate with her. So I think this is a game changer. It really is. What we've been doing is not good enough, quite frankly. We've got to look at this kind of colander where lots of things are sizzling out. Lots of reviews are underway, as Andy was saying, up in Manchester, that we can't trust. And what the police are now saying, we can't go on as we are. And the threats are now in our city. We better start thinking about the strategy.
Well, we're going to come back to that in the next hour, John Prescott. Now, this morning, Paul Nuttall unveiled UKIP's general election manifesto in Westminster. It comes as some low-key campaigning by other parties restarted. It stopped after Monday evening's attack. So what have we learned? Well, Paul Nuttall has pledged to tackle radical Islam. He said anybody who left the UK to fight for so-called Islamic State should forfeit their passport and never be allowed to return. The manifesto promises 20,000 extra police officers, 20,000 extra troops, 7,000 extra prison officers and 4,000 extra border guards. UKIP would reduce net migration to zero within 5 years and they would ban the wearing of face coverings in public places. UKIP are offering an extra £11 billion every year for the NHS and social care by 2022, and that would be funded largely by cuts in foreign aid. There would be a rise in the threshold for paying income tax to £13,500. That's over £1,000 more than the direction it's currently going in. And UKIP promises a cut in taxes for middle earners, as well as a cut in VAT on household bills. UKIP's manifesto promises to axe tuition fees, but not for every degree, but especially for science, technology, engineering, maths and medicines, the STEM skills. And there's a pledge to provide up to 100,000 new homes for younger people every year. Excuse me. On pensions, UKIP would maintain the triple lock, which sees them rise by the higher of prices, average earnings, or 2.5%. Now, launching the manifesto, UKIP leader Paul Nuttall described the decision to launch it as a message to terrorists that they will not win?
It is the duty of democratic politics to confront the most serious issues of our time, and a general election campaign is the most appropriate moment for those issues to be debated. It is also our chance to send a message to those who hate our way of life, our values and our democracy. The message is clear: you will not win. Expressing sympathy with those killed and maimed in Manchester is important, but it is not enough to light candles or signal our upset on social media. When you are a leader of a political party, you have a duty to set out how you would protect the people of your country from the threat to their entire way of life.
And taking questions from journalists at the end of the launch, the BBC's political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, was loudly heckled after suggesting to Paul Nuttall that he was trying to blame the Prime Minister for the bomb attack in Manchester.
It sounds like you're near as damn it blaming the Prime Minister for this attack and the circumstances that led to it.
Is that the BBC? By any chance?
Did you ask United players why they played last night?
Please, let's be respectful. No, I'm not accusing the Prime Minister. I'm saying that politicians in this country have been weak on this issue for many years. In terms of her record as Home Secretary, I think it's appalling. This is a Home Secretary who cut the numbers of police officers, cut the number of border guards, cut the number of prison officers. I'm sorry, it isn't a good record at all. But as for blaming her personally for the attack, absolutely not. I'm not doing that. What I am saying is that the politicians in this country are too cowardly at the moment to actually face up to what the real issue is.
And UKIP's Deputy Chairman, Suzanne Evans, joins us now. Now, I understand at that press launch you said that the Prime Minister, quote, must bear some responsibility for what happened in Manchester. What do you mean by that?
I don't think so. I made it perfectly clear at the press conference that the only people to blame for the tragic events on Monday night were the terrorists who plotted and carried out this atrocity. And I want to make that absolutely crystal
clear. So when you
clear.
say that Mrs May must bear some responsibility, then what do you mean? To what are you referring?
I think that we have had successive Labour and Conservative governments who have failed to put the security of our nation and the safety of the British people first. And I think that is the first job of any government. We spelled it out at our press conference. We want to put another 20,000 police back on our streets because that is almost about the number that have been cut over the past few years. We want to put 4,000 more border guards because that again is a number that's been cut over the past few years. We're an island. We should have a natural ability to be able to protect ourselves. And yet our borders have been deliberately opened, not least of all by John Prescott's government as well in 1997, where there was a deliberate attempt to go out and invite people to Britain whose way of life was actually fundamentally incompatible with ours.
But the suicide bomber...
what we're saying is that the cowardice of previous politicians, I'm afraid, has contributed to an environment where this kind of ideology has been allowed to flourish.
But the suicide bomber, Abedi, was born in this country. What does being an island, what's that got to do with it?
There's two separate issues to this, and again, we made this clear this morning. Immigration, I mean, his parents were not born here, and it's pretty clear now, I think, that his parents were people who perhaps helped to radicalise him as well. It sounds as though they had even a part to play in this attack. Which,
well, we don't know. We haven't got the evidence for that yet.
You know, there's no doubt that, as I said, there are people who have migrated to Britain in the past 40 years or so, who have never even tried to adapt to our way of life. There has been this philosophy of multiculturalism, and I mean a philosophy of multiculturalism. I'm not talking about multi-ethnicity, which nobody has any problem with. This philosophy of multiculturalism, where people have been allowed to come and live in Britain, and they are allowed to carry on behaving in exactly the same way as they would in their countries of origin. This is why we now have record numbers of young girls and women in this country living at risk of female genital mutilation in this country, in Britain. It's why we have honour crimes, it's why we have, even from the African practice of breast ironing, these appalling cultural practices, and cowardly politicians have not stood against them hard enough.
But for a long while, this suicide bomber behaved like a normal British kid. He followed Manchester United, he played cricket, he got to Salford University. Something obviously changed, I understand that. But I don't see what that's got to do with the number of police on the streets or having tougher borders or so on. These things are very complicated. We don't quite understand how this radicalisation could take place. But to say that all the politicians have to have some responsibility for this just seems to me to be spraying around blame.
I think what we have to do is we have to tackle not just the violent crimes when they occur, we have to tackle the ideology behind this as well. And unfortunately, our politicians have, rather than tackle the ideology, they have in many ways actually massaged it. So for instance, Theresa May herself has spoken about how she has no problem with Sharia councils operating in Britain. She said she has no problem with the niqab or the burqa, which for me are unequivocal symptoms of the oppression of women that she of all people should be standing against. Now, I understand this is not a simple issue. I'm not going to say UKIP's manifesto is going to solve all these problems, but Andrew, for God's sake, we have children dying. What are we supposed to do? We cannot just carry on as normal. We have to try a new approach because the current approach is simply not working.
What is the connection between wearing the niqab and what happened in Manchester on Monday night?
There is a connection because we have allowed these radical, extreme ideologies a place in our society. They have, in a sense, become legitimised by, somebody. I'm not saying that every Muslim woman wearing a veil is, of course, going to commit an atrocity. I know women who have worn the veil.
It wasn't a woman wearing a niqab that committed the atrocity.
It wasn't. But my point
is, I'm not aware.
We need to make a stand against these practices in Britain that are just not compatible with our values. And as I say, you might not like the answers that we give, but I think in politics we have a duty to at least try and make a difference. And the fact is, the status quo is simply not working.
Let's just hear again what you did have to say at the UKIP manifesto launch this morning. Let's hear it.
I think she must bear some responsibility. All politicians who voted against measures or voted for measures to make cuts bear some responsibility. As I said, Adam, I think when 9/11 happened, we should have had a serious rethink about immigration. It didn't happen.
Again, you link this to immigration, but it's hard to see the evidence. And can I point out that the parents of the suicide bomber came to this country because they were opposed to Gaddafi, which was also British policy at the time to be opposed to Gaddafi. They were welcomed into this country at the time because they were seen to be on the same song sheet as British policy.
Andrew, you don't need to talk to me about that.
What's the problem?
I was a journalist when I remember some Kurdish refugees from Iraq came into this country seeking asylum, and they were sent back home because the government said, oh, Saddam Hussein's a nice bloke, he's not gassing the Kurds. That turned out to be complete, politicians, foreign policy does change, and this is the point. Nobody ever seems to be able to stand up against evil wherever they see it.
Well, how can you base an immigration policy on this couple coming in? At the time they had no children. And they come to Britain, they are fleeing Gaddafi at the time. How can you base an immigration policy? We're not going to let you in because your kid might turn out to be a suicide bomber. How is that a rational basis for proceeding?
Well, funnily enough, those words are not in our manifesto, Andrew. My point
but you're the one linking what happened in Manchester to immigration.
I'm linking, no, actually, that's not what we're doing, actually. We are talking separately about having a sensible immigration policy, a policy that says there are too many people coming into Britain and too many people who
just linked immigration to the Prime Minister's responsibility to what happened.
That clip was actually, we were talking there about the cuts that she'd made to the border force, to the police force, to our armed services.
But people just heard what you said. You went on to link it to immigration.
Well, immigration has been a problem as well, yeah. And I stand by what I said. After 9/11, we should have thought, my goodness, we've got this massive problem with Islamist terror in this country. Maybe we should just stop letting people who share these ideals from coming in. And that's what our manifesto says today. We say zero net migration over a period of 5 years and to have a compatibility test so that people coming in, we can test their social values, and if they're incompatible with Britain, why should we let them in?
Is there not something quite desperate about UKIP now? You're being marginalised in this election, you've crashed in the polls, your vote's going back to the Tories, you're no longer a threat to Labour in the north, and you've now decided to make immigration And what happened in Manchester, your kind of last-ditch stand,
Okay,
and it's unsavoury.
It's not unsavoury, and I tell you, it's also not true what you're saying. Nigel Farage was talking about these issues at our very height in 2014. You probably criticised him then as well for talking about it, saying it was unsavoury. The fact is, UKIP has been talking about these issues for at least the last 3 years. This manifesto and our integration ideas and our policies were launched last month. This manifesto was put to bed before the Manchester Act. So don't you dare accuse us of trying to be opportunist here. We're trying to respond to a serious issue in this country that, frankly, the other politicians, they don't even speak its name. They can't even bring themselves to say the words Islamist terrorism. And that's pretty unsavoury too.
Let's look just at this one-in, one-out immigration policy. Because your policy will now be that no matter how many doctors we need in the NHS, no matter how many high-tech skilled people we need for all of the growing high-tech hubs across this country, we can't have any unless someone leaves the country.
OK, you're rather missing the point, is that we're also saying in our manifesto that we're abolishing tuition fees for students of science, technology, engineering, medicine and maths, because we need to start training up our own people.
But that'll take years. What do we do now? We're short of doctors now. We're short of high-tech specialists now. But you will not allow them to come in unless somebody leaves.
Well,
I mean, it's a bizarre suggestion.
It doesn't work like that, Andrew. This is why I made it clear your introduction was wrong. We're not going to take migration to zero for 5 years. We're going to have a target of zero net migration over a 5-year period.
Well, that's the same thing.
No, it's not. In that period where we're training up our own people, we can still have up to 300,000 migrants a year coming to Britain. I don't think anybody would think that that was an unreasonable
But after
number.
5 years, the net migration will be zero under your plan, correct?
It's still 300,000 people coming in.
Well, it's 248,000, the latest figure. Your net migration figure will be zero under your plan, and it will bear no relationship to the economic needs of this country.
Of course it will. Of course it will. Because
well, then you can't have it at zero.
Yes, we can, because we prioritise in those 250, 300,000 people who are coming in, we prioritise the skills that we need. That's why we've also said we're going to have a moratorium on unskilled labour for 5 years. We see absolutely no logic in having up to nearly a million young people unemployed in our country who can do the jobs that at the moment big businesses are cynically exploiting migrants from overseas to do. Instead of giving jobs to British people and paying them a decent living wage, they're importing in cheap labour from overseas.
What's the unemployment rate in Britain now?
That's got to stop. I'm not sure what the current figures, I'll be honest.
4.7%, it's the lowest for 42 years. The labour market is very tight, but a growing economy needs more labour. And a lot of it needs to be skilled. Look, every politician's ever sat in that chair has promised to do more on skills. By and large, they've nearly all failed.
Well,
and you are now going to create a massive skill shortage in the years to come, which will undermine the economic growth of this country, all because your immigration policy says this brain surgeon doctor who wants to come to Britain cannot come in unless I retire abroad.
Andrew, I think
that's what you're saying.
You're very sensible usually, but I think you're hyping this up to the extreme. Our policies, if you take them as a whole in our manifesto, we're putting a huge amount of money into training doctors, nurses, emergency workers, policemen, border force control, prison officers. We are investing in these people. And the great thing about UKIP's policies is, unlike the other politicians who've sat in this chair and have made promises they can't keep, we know where our money is coming from. We have a spending
you're
pot
going
of
to cut.
35
You're going to
billion
cut off aid to the poorest in the world.
No, we're not. We are going to keep aid at 2%, 0.12% of GNI, and we'll be paying the same percentage-wise as America and more in cash terms than Spain and Italy combined.
Military.
I would not be in UKIP and writing that manifesto if I believed that our party was cutting off aid to the neediest in the world. I would not be here. That is not what we intend to do.
John
and
Prescott.
not only are we going to continue to spend £4 billion aid on humanitarian relief, we're going to have a hospital ship as well. We've budgeted 500 million for that to increase our capacity to deliver aid around the world.
John Prescott, you've been listening. What do you make of it?
Well, I welcome debates about anything, and particularly migration is a very important issue. There's no doubt about it. Parties are debating it. The real problem comes into the solutions. When you start setting the targets, you then have to explain why you'll get it down to zero. She can't do it in a few years to get down to something like 100,000. There are very real problems, but some of the facts, you know, police were actually increased under Labour, not reduced. So you can't blame us for that.
But
they were reduced afterwards. And I just wonder, when you said these skilled people, a brain surgeon.
We're not going to stop any brain surgeons coming
wait
to
a
the
minute.
country, that's for sure.
I just want to say, it's not so much. What if they came from Libya or Iraq? Would you deny them then because of where they come from?
No,
when you do
or
do you
as they
let
are
them
going
in,
to
or
come
do you
here.
find out what their background was? Were their parents actually supporting some radical movement which we were encouraging Britain over in Libya? Is that what you have to, is that the depth of inquiry you will go into
John,
to stop people from coming?
Just because you're a brain surgeon, you know, we want. I think talking about a specific occupation is a little bit tangential, but you know, we are not going to stop any brain surgeons that we need coming to Britain.
Well, take a doctor, take anything. Don't leave out the brain surgeon. That was the one that was mentioned. Are you going to investigate the background of people who come from countries that you obviously assume to be evil countries, where there are Muslims? Will you investigate that? You've just done it with the mother and father of the person who's been accused of this bombing in Manchester. Would you go into the background to do that then as well?
No, we test attitudes.
Well, how do you do that?
You and I both know, John, that you know.
What do you mean? A question at the actual port of entry?
No, a question in advance when you were applying for your visa or your work permit.
And what sort of questions would you ask them then about their religious background? Would they have to say they're Muslim?
They might well do, but
Would they be
that is
required
not
to?
a problem. You can be Muslim, and you can support the rights of women. You can support the rights of gay people. But it is about
so you would
it's
ask
about
that kind of,
social
do you
attitudes.
support gay
Yeah.
people? Is that the sort of questioning you're going to subject to people who come here to Britain, perhaps to be the brain surgeon or the doctor?
What's your answer, John? You know, under your government,
There are
under Labour
difficulties.
government, you literally went out seeking migrants whose views were incompatible with the British way of life because you wanted to rub the nose of the right in diversity.
No,
That
no.
was the
Well,
phrase,
let's just
wasn't
put
it?
that factually.
You just
What it
actually
meant.
opened it out.
Well, what it meant, and I supported that. I didn't believe in a federal Europe, which presumably is what you believe in as well. You don't want that Europe structure. And what it was said, what will Eastern European countries do? And there were people like me and others who thought, let's get them into the European community, and then there will be a better political balance between the strength of France and Germany. These are strategic
Really
decisions
worked well,
to
didn't
make.
it, that, John?
Well, if they came over here because we're an economy which can give them jobs.
That's right, and taking jobs from our young people.
Well, for 10 years I was a seaman. I tried to get a job on American ships. Why? Because the money was more than I could get on the British ship. It's kind of a motivation you are faced with. These are normal economic facts. All you want to do is to make it look evil, that if you're from certain countries, if you're wearing a burqa or you're an immigrant, you are feeding the fears that are causing the problems in this country today.
No, John.
There's a connection to Manchester.
John, you are
Final word.
You are feeding the fears because you are not facing up to the reality here of Islamist
Well, let
terror.
the electorate
We
decide.
have got to do something about it.
All right, we'll leave it there. Suzanne Evans, on the day you launched your party's manifesto, thank you for coming in. We're just getting a briefing from a senior Whitehall source that said that Salman Abedi, the suicide bomber in Manchester who blew himself up, was one of a larger pool of what's called former subjects of interest whose risk remains subject to review by MI5 and other security institutions. It was pointed out that MI5 is managing around 500 active investigations at any one time, involving some 3,000 subjects of interest at any one time, which I think gives us an idea of the scale of the challenge that faces our security services at a time like this. So what can politicians do to try and prevent attacks like the one we saw in Manchester on Monday night? We've seen what UKIP has had to offer, but let's take a look at what some of the other political party manifestos have to say about counter-terrorism policy. The Conservative Party says that if it's re-elected, it would set up a commission for countering extremism, which they say would identify examples of extremism and expose them. They would also consider creating new criminal offences to try and help police and prosecutors tackle extremists. And they would create a new national infrastructure police force to protect key strategic locations across the country, like railway stations and nuclear power sites. As for Labour, they would carry out a review of the Anti-Radicalisation Prevent programme to address the concern that it can, in their words, quote, alienate minority communities. Labour would also bring in new judicial oversight of the investigatory powers used by the authorities. And an incoming Labour government would recruit an extra 10,000 police officers across England and Wales. The Liberal Democrats would scrap the Prevent programme, replace it with a scheme more focused on what they call community engagement. And the Lib Dems say they would roll back state surveillance powers. They say that people should be notified when they've been placed under surveillance, if, in their words, that can be done without jeopardising ongoing investigations. Excuse me. As for the SNP, we don't yet have their manifesto, but in their last one for the Scottish Parliament elections in 2016, they said that they would continue to work closely with partners in the UK and further afield to tackle extremism and terrorism. We're joined now by the director of the Right of Centre think tank Policy Exchange, Dean Godson, and Raffaello Pantucci of the security think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, also known as RUSI. Welcome to both of you. From what you've seen of the party's policies on extremism and terrorism, are you impressed by any of that?
There's a lot of good stuff in there. First of all, the National Extremism Commission to keep the issue of ideology and upstream extremist views on the national agenda very good. The online extremism powers, the new proposed powers, are very welcome. The broader policies for national infrastructure.
What would this commission do?
Well, let's take first of all, name and shame. Put a sharp focus on those groupings that are not doing enough to combat the culture, the grievance-mongering culture, the culture of extremism, the upstream ideology of anti-British narratives. Lord Carlisle started it in his oversight of the review in 2011. It needs to be weaponised now, and this is a good way of starting it.
What do you make of what the parties are proposing?
I mean, I think I'm struck in many ways by how little there is really in the manifestos. I think Dean is right. There is some detail in the Tory one which demonstrates a certain level of thought and focus on this. But if we look at the Lib Dem and the Labour one, we can see that really they're only talking about surveillance powers and prevent without sort of engaging with the bigger issues. And in some ways, what's striking is the degree to which this has not really been a focus of the election campaign so far.
Is it not the case that the mainstream politicians are running out of ideas about how to deal with this?
Look, like cancer, the problem of extremism, violent extremism, it keeps metastasizing in new forms, new sources of it. Some pretty old sources. We've had many problems over the years with Libya, obviously, from the IRA time. We've had a problem, as we've seen with the WPC Fletcher thing. We've had problems
but those who are fighting
pro-Gaddafi people and anti-Gaddafi.
Those who are fighting cancer are coming up with amazing new ideas almost every day to tackle it. That's not the case of politicians who are trying to fight the cancer of terrorism.
Everybody's got to raise their game, but this is a sort of more complex. This is, shall we say, art, perhaps not science, not medical science. And if you look at past measures, take the 2011 Prevent Review. Everyone said it would drive elements of Muslim communities into a corner. It didn't. We've actually had some years now where some of the most extreme manifestations of extremism have been tamped down. They're now, as you rightly say, coming back. And that's why we've got to keep ahead of the game. And that's why these measures in the manifesto, Conservative manifesto included, are particularly useful.
If the parties consulted you for advice on this, what they should have put in their manifestos, what would you have told them?
I mean, I think that there's, when you're talking about counterterrorism, in many ways you're talking about something that's very technical and involving people and the skills that are required to actually sort of go investigate and disrupt networks is a fairly sort of technical set of skills that someone who's fighting a political campaign won't necessarily be sort of well placed to sort of delve into the detail of. So I would argue that that sort of side of it, the sort of what they describe as pursue and protect and prepare side, the very sort of technical how to protect people, how to do with investigations, is one piece which I think broadly there's a consensus that we're moving in the right direction and basically leave it to the professionals to sort of handle. And I think that's probably the right approach. The question really is the prevent part. And the prevent part is the part which is in some ways the forward-looking part. It's trying to figure out, well, how do we get ahead of the curve? How do you stop it so people don't become subjects of investigations, don't get involved in these sorts of networks, and actually steering them off that path early? And in some ways, what I would argue is that when we're looking at the prevent space, you're looking at a space that is really quite broad, that on some sides is basically about managing people who have been radicalized, who've been through investigation, maybe gone to prison, who've come out of prison, and now what do you do with them? You need to figure out something to do with them. You know that they've got some experience and everything else, which requires careful management. But then PREVENT also includes the way other end of the spectrum, which is much more about the community engagement piece, about trying to work with communities of young people who may be from which we've seen some individual radicals emerge. And I'd argue that sticking these together under the sort of broad umbrella of PREVENT might be sticking a bit too much. And it might be a question of maybe separating things out a little bit more and trying to break away the piece of the sort of softer end and putting it into a sort of non-security environment and keeping the other part, which is clearly still a security question, within that space.
John Prescott, Labour invented PREVENT and introduced it, and it was a way to try and stop the spread of Islamist ideas in the Muslim community. But now your party's manifesto seems more worried about its, quote, potential to alienate minority communities. Is that fair?
Some of the signs are, when you talk within the community, they actually feel they're picking them as the enemy, and you therefore report on who you think are threatening in this game. And that has questioned the role of it. I think there's still a role for it, but to my mind, when you talk about the big issues, you don't have said the big issue that we're avoiding. To my mind, the big issue is, how do you bring all these parts together? Now, politicians, as we see in both the manifestos, say there's a reduction in the police, and when you'll see it's 1,600 armed police go missing, and you bring in 1,600 armed soldiers. Now, 20,000 police out of it means they're not able to do an effective job. The firemen's reduced, the nurses, the doctors all reduced. Now, if we could get out of the political argument, we'll do 10,000, you do 15,000, we put it in a manifesto. That's right. But if you want to really deal with this problem, we're dealing with it at the community level. PREVENT was a start towards that, but unfortunately, the way it's developed, people have got critical of that. I think Andy of Manchester said when he was Home Secretary, he wasn't favourable to that. Why don't we bring it all together? All politicians come to an agreement that what the cities need to be safe and secure is the proper public services. We need to deal with the anti-terrorism. I mean, it's not mentioned in the Tories what that policy means. Perhaps we need to get down and talk about it, but I'd go further. I mean, regime change in the Middle East hasn't helped, has it? Well, in Libya, for example, Mr. Cameron went there, Mr. Blair was talking about how you can get them work, but the policy came out then to place the regime and join rebels. So what we've got is almost a religious war going out of these countries. We back one side or the other, and basically that is making it more difficult to deal with. And to go now to NATO and talk to Trump, and he goes to Saudi Arabia and said we must now have almost, like somebody's called, a kind of going back to the Crusades. I think it was it the American president who said it's crusade. There is a war going on about cultures. There's a war going on about religion. We've really got to sit down and ask ourselves, what do we do in this country? Why? Because it's no longer like with the IRA and others that they organise bomb by groups of people. This is individual who've confined up in their minds. They've got to do something to help their people. And they do this terrible thing that's happened in Manchester. You can't justify it, but you better start thinking what's motivating it, and you've got to get into the community for that.
Whether now, though, this doesn't look like a lone wolf in that case. And of course, Libya was a broken society long before David Cameron became Prime Minister, or even Tony Blair obviously trying to bring Gaddafi in from the cold as he did after '03. In fact, what you're looking at...
But they were holding it together, not in the way you like, but they were.
Well, it was a pretty bleak...
Get rid of the regime.
It was a pretty bleak way.
There.
But the thing about the Libyan community in this country is, on the basis of what they're saying, let's find out whether it's so, they're saying that their warnings were ignored. It seems that they're actually complaining that PREVENT, far from being oppressive of them, that they're not being listened to.
Well, let's come back to PREVENT. Whether you call it PREVENT or something else or do something different, the fact is that that the job of the security services is to deal with things when PREVENT has failed. How do we improve PREVENT? How do we reach into the Muslim communities with the leaders of the communities to stop this sort of thing from spreading? What needs to be done?
I think one of the phrases that's interesting there is the question of leaders of communities, because we play, of course, and that was one of the problems with the policies and the elements of the last Labour government. There were big disagreements, of course, between people like Hazel Blears and Jack Straw on that, about whether community leaders were the right way to behave. Why do we behave in a neo-imperialist way within our own borders, looking for community leaders to deliver Muslim communities when those leaders don't necessarily represent those Muslims?
Well, if not leaders, what do we do?
Well, because we treat them like citizens like anyone else, and we have an engagement at the grassroots. Not, as you say, we have to up our game. It's not been good enough under any government at the grassroots, but there's been a start made at the top end, and we now need to engage more closely at the grassroots with citizens, with Muslim citizens of whatever affiliation.
Let me get a final comment from you on that.
I mean, I think that, you know, I've spoken to lots of people who are working on prevent programs around the country, on the ground, and what always surprises me, they actually come back with very positive comments and remarks about the specific program that they've engaged in. And I think that's the thing that we always have to remember. On the ground, it does actually seem to work. There are just some very loud voices that tend to dominate the conversation publicly. And I think we have to be very careful not to get totally distracted by that and warp the entire policy, which actually in some parts does work. As I say, my point would be maybe we need to take some of those softer elements that really aren't sort of the hard end of security and find a way of shifting them out of the security space.
All right. I thank you both for being with us. Now, yesterday saw almost 1,000 troops deployed on our streets to backfill for the police, while the terror threat level is raised to critical following the Manchester bombing. That means an attack may be imminent. Troops will be used to guard important buildings, so the Army was drafted into Parliament. We also saw members of the Army stationed in Whitehall, Downing Street and at Buckingham Palace. The head of the Metropolitan Police, the new head, Cressida Dick, said having soldiers to do these patrols helped to free up the police at this difficult time.
Whilst we're at critical and there is the possibility of a further attack, we want to be able to support the public as best we can and to protect them as best we can, and we believe we need more armed officers on the streets. So putting military colleagues on what I would call static posts, in this case Palace of Westminster, allows us to put police officers with firearms in greater numbers out on the streets of the whole UK.
That's the new head of the Metropolitan Police, Britain's most important police chief. We're joined now by Steve White, chair of the Police Federation. It's the staff association for police constables, sergeants and inspectors. This deployment of armed personnel, of the military on our streets, is that anything more than symbolic?
Well, I never thought that I would see the day, to be perfectly frank, and I think we've got to recognise that whilst these events are fast moving, the brilliant response of the emergency services and the police service as a whole has been second to none. However, and of course the support of our military colleagues are clearly needed. That they're clearly needed because, unfortunately, in a situation such as this, that the current police service is not structured to deal with it in a prolonged way. Of course, what happened on Monday night, the response by officers in Greater Manchester, as happened on the 22nd of March, has been absolutely superb. But this is about a sustained level of threat. And by virtue of us saying that armed military are having to replace armed police officers in order to release that resource, clearly sends a concerning message. I understand that, but I still do wonder if it's anything more than symbolic. Let's put the picture up and see this, because as you say, it is quite a remarkable picture to see. If we can just get it up on the screen, to see our police officers going down the streets with armed soldiers as well. We haven't seemed to be able to get the picture up there. Yeah, there we have it. So it's worth dwelling on that, to see in Britain in the summer of 2017. But it's only, as I understand it, several hundred. The French, something that I've followed and know well, the French are deploying 10,000 troops a day across France. You see them everywhere you go, not just in Paris. I left from a provincial TGV train station recently. 4 well-armed soldiers going up and down the station before we got onto the train. We're not at that level yet, which is why, or anywhere near it, which is why I just suggest it seems to be more symbolic than of any real practical impact. Well, it provides a practical impact because it releases officers in order to be available should something else happen. But I think that the main difference with policing in the UK and policing abroad is about this policing by consent model, and it's about embedding the police service within local communities, which is so vitally important. That is worth many, many, many soldiers and military personnel on the streets. And I think the lesson that's got to be learned from these awful incidents has got to be armed police officers being deployed are not going to prevent further attacks. They're going to be able to respond to the attack. What we've got to concentrate on is how we prevent it in the first place. And the first point of policing and a police constable is the prevention of crime in the first place. And it's making sure that we invest the time and the energy and the resources and the specialisms to get into the communities, those hard to reach areas, so that this 22-year-old who carried out this awful atrocity is known to local people. The local people have trust and confidence to be able to
But he was. I mean, that even with the cut in police numbers, and I know you've been very concerned about that, Salman Abedi was known to the police. Friends reported him to the anti-terrorism hotline 5 years ago. He was flying a flag that looked like an ISIS symbol from his window. It had Arabic writing on it. He was loudly repeating prayers and the Quran on the streets. People thought that strange. He was reported. I mean, it wasn't a lack of police numbers. There's a failure somewhere, which is not to do with numbers here.
Well, no, don't forget that actually what's happened over the past 5 years is the cut in police numbers. Chief constables have been having to make very difficult decisions. That's involved a cut in police firearms capability and certainly embedded neighbourhood policing. This isn't about having police officers responding to calls. This is about having embedded neighbourhood policing, knowing your communities, knowing who should be there, asking the questions, why hasn't this person been seen? All of that kind of stuff is very, very difficult to measure, of course, in terms of outcomes and KPIs and all this kind of stuff.
We've got performance indicators.
Well, yeah, which we're not supposed to have anymore, but we sort of still do. But it's easy to measure some things. It's very difficult to measure the value of neighbourhood policing and increasing that level of confidence. And we've got to get back to that. And we've got to make sure that the resources are there. I predicted 2 years ago that we would end up seeing a paramilitary style of policing, which if that's what the public wants, that's what we can provide. And the image that you had on the screen there is just, the start potentially of that.
It's a potential, though. It hasn't happened.
It is potential. We've got an opportunity now. I'm not here to talk about politics. I'm here to talk about policing, and I'm here to ask every politician to raise the debate, ask the public what they want from their police service, and I think what they would like to see are more police officers and less military on the streets.
All right, just very brief comment, John. We haven't got much time.
I would ask you, we brought in community policing, and what happened there, community talks to their own people and they pass it on to the police. If you go and tell a police constable or you tell a soldier, that prevents the community telling you what's going on, whether it's the black flag, and we lost thousands of the community policing. I think that's important. When you mean community policing, you might mean a policeman-made community, but there is this gulf between the police and indeed the public. The community police used to fill it in, and people trusted them to pass on the information to the authorities.
Right.
This is becoming increasingly clear. They don't tell anybody.
We need to end it there, but we thank you for coming on. This story obviously isn't going to go away. Now, it's emerged that the Manchester Arena bomber, Salman Abedi, returned from Libya just days before Monday's attack. The Abedi family were part of a large Libyan community in Manchester. Those travelling to and from the war-torn country are said to be of increasing concern to the security services. So what is the Libyan connection with the Manchester attack? Here's Ellie Price.
The face of the homegrown suicide bomber. Police have spent much of the investigation searching houses owned by family and friends of Salman Abedi in Manchester. But it's his links to Libya that could give security services the biggest clues. Yesterday, his brother Hashim was detained in Libya for supporting so-called Islamic State. And his father, Ramadan Abedi. His Facebook shows him supporting fighters in Syria affiliated with Al-Qaeda. And then yesterday, moments after doing this interview, he too was arrested. The BBC understands Salman Abedi's parents fled Libya to the UK in the 1990s, along with many other opponents of Colonel Gaddafi's regime. In 2004, a new relationship was established between Tony Blair and Colonel Gaddafi, which the British government hoped would help in the fight against terrorism. But it meant focus by the British intelligence sources fell on many of those dissidents who had fled Libya and come to places like Manchester, amid fears they were aligned to Al-Qaeda. They say their jihad was against Gaddafi alone. They wanted him overthrown. And by 2011, as the Arab Spring grew, many of those who had fled the UK returned to Libya to topple Gaddafi, including the Manchester bomber's father, Ramadan Abedi. There was no single group in charge of the rebellion, and after Gaddafi was removed, some 1,700 armed groups emerged. Crucially, the so-called Islamic State was able to gain a foothold in several key cities. Whereas in recent years Libya was seen as a setting-off point for foreign fighters making their way to join IS in Iraq and Syria, analysts now think the country, with its easy transport routes across the Mediterranean, is a magnet for extremists determined to bring their violence to Europe.
And we're joined now from Middlesbrough by the former British ambassador to Libya, Richard Dalton. Richard Dalton, what do you think is the significance of this Libyan connection to what happened in Manchester?
The security services will always have had their eyes on that connection. Hitherto, they've judged it of relatively low priority, given the multiplicity of origins of other people of interest who might take extremist action. But the important thing to remember is that the Libyans were producing jihadis for Iraq long before the state collapsed with the revolution in 2011 and the further collapse in 2013. So whereas we find that our own citizens can be radicalized at home, we find that the Belgians, the French have the same problem. There is sometimes an external element. And at the moment, with this very preliminary stage of the investigation, we just don't know what part individuals in Libya played in getting Salman Abidi to that point on Monday night.
No, and indeed, we don't know if he was trained or radicalized in Libya. But it is, I think, would you agree, it's pretty much a failed state and therefore fertile ground for jihadis, isn't it?
As I said, it was producing jihadis long before it was a failed state, and Belgium is not exactly a failed state, but produced some of the worst jihadi atrocities that we've seen recently. But yes, Libya has failed to make good on the promise of the revolution in 2012 and 2013. It's fallen to bits. But remember that the Islamic State presence in Sirte, which was a real area in which other Libyan authorities couldn't go and check what was going on, has been extinguished by armed action from the next door city Misrata, and there is an active struggle against jihadis going on in Benghazi. So Libya isn't quite as bad as Iraq and Syria as a source of grievance. But the other point to remember is that in enhancing perhaps what Mr. Prescott was saying about looking at the narrative which jihadis use to justify their action, that's an essential part of the prevent strategy, and we have to act in our foreign policy to reduce that element of motivation, and at present we are simply not doing that. Not only did we kick over the hive in 2003 in an illegal invasion of Iraq, which led to the formation of the Islamist bodies, which in turn turned into Islamic State, but by supporting Saudi Arabia in their dreadful war in Yemen, we are also reinforcing the narrative that the West has got it in for Muslims, particularly in the Middle East. We need to act justly overseas as one part, a small part may be, but a necessary part of the overall struggle to prevent people being radicalized.
So what change, Ambassador, should there be in our foreign policy to achieve that?
Well, we need to rein back from the war in Yemen, which incidentally has significantly enhanced the capacity of Al-Qaeda, not only in that country, but possibly internationally. Secondly, we need to adopt a more neutral position that favors active measures to pursue a settlement between Israel and its Palestinian neighbors, rather than stand back from it as we are doing at present. And thirdly, we need to carry on the pursuit we are already engaged in of political settlements in both Iraq and Syria, and also in Libya, to try and create stable states long term.
Just briefly, Ambassador, are you optimistic that that agenda will be adopted, or is it unlikely?
At present it's unlikely, because post-Brexit commercial considerations are too dominant in our foreign policy at the expense of the search for creative solutions. So we are thinking in terms of alliances and sales rather than getting to the roots of problems.
All right, Ambassador, I'm going to stop you there, but I thank you for joining us today on the Daily Politics. That's it for the Daily Politics today. I'll be back on BBC One tonight with another edition of This Week at around 11:45. I hope you can join me. Till then, bye-bye.
Total strangers need to find some common ground next on BBC Two. Richard Osman's quizzing with two tribes.
The most prestigious flower show